Good morning or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're sitting in. I'd like to welcome you here to our webinar today, Bitchy, Bossy, and Too Ambitious, Making Female Power the Norm. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Glucuho Health and Wellness Committee. My name is Jeremy Alexander. I'm the technology coordinator, and I'm hosted at Eastern Illinois University, and I'll serve as the moderator for your webinar today. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you to maximize your learning for this session. To ask questions, please type your question in the Q&A section in the bottom of your Zoom panel. The presenters will answer the questions as soon as possible, but we want to make sure that there's enough time to cover all of the materials. Should you experience any technical problems, please type in a chat box and I'll work to assist you to resolve that issue. At the end of the session, the presentation audio recording will be available on our Glucuho website at glucuho.org under the webinar resources section for your future reference. We encourage you to share this resource with your colleagues who are unable to attend, and it will be posted as early as Friday. At this time, I'll hand it over to Katie and Michelle to get us started today.
Great, thanks so much, Jeremy. I am excited to be here with you all this afternoon, and we are going to introduce ourselves here in just a moment, but wanted to kind of do, again, some more housekeeping, different housekeeping than what Jeremy just did. So we are going to encourage you all to sit back, relax, take some really good notes, and if you are a non-female identifying member of this group, we want to say thank you for joining us, and we are hopeful that you will be able to take some of this information away with you for being able to work with some of your female identified colleagues in the future. So we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started.
Awesome. So just identify some learning outcomes for us this morning or afternoon. First, participants will be able to identify behaviors and experiences that affect or impact their role as professional identified women. Participants will explore ways to be successful in male-dominated types of environments, specifically for us within the workplace. And then participants will create a community of support that extends beyond annual conference. So to accomplish those things for today's agenda, we're going to be focusing on a couple different things. First, why we need the conversation, why this is even a topic that Michelle and I are passionate about and something we continue to want to present on. Then we're going to talk about some behaviors to identify, things to acknowledge that you haven't noticed that these are what are taking place in your work setting. Then we're going to talk about the fight moves. These are the things that we can do to counteract some of these behaviors when they happen. Then we'll talk about a culture of community, talking about what we can do to support one another, stand up as allies, and be able to just make a better space for each other, knowing we can't do this by ourselves. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some takeaways and, of course, discussion and questions.
All right, so we wanted to spend a moment introducing ourselves. So I'll begin and then we'll pass it over to Katie. So my name is Michelle Soyka. I'm at the University of Cincinnati. I serve as the Assistant Director of Operations for Resident Education and Development. I use the pronoun she, her, hers, and I identify as a cisgender white female. My experiences are more of that mid-level staff member working in the operations-focused role. And I call myself a daughter, a sister, both blood and Greek affiliated, wife, mommy, baseball enthusiast with baseball starting tomorrow, of course, a feminist and a podcaster. Why it's really important for me is that most of my supervisors through my career of coming up on 20 years here have been men, and they don't understand in the same way that women do how to support and advocate for me at the tables that they're at, or how to coach me on having conversations that are difficult. And in 2017, I transitioned into this more operations focused role, and found that the overt and covert sexism was just really blatant in the daily work that I was doing. And so I continue to be inspired by and work for my sisters, again, both my biological and Greek affiliated sisters, my two daughters, and the other professional women who are around me. Katie?
Thanks, Michelle. So I am Katie. I use she, her pronouns. I am an area coordinator also at the University of Cincinnati. I am a cisgender white woman as well, identifying as female. I'm a mid-level professional. So similar to Michelle, I've been here for a minute, but this is actually my first year also with a female identifying supervisor. So that is something that I have faced since I was an RA. I've never had a female supervising or female identifying supervisor until this year. And then just a couple other things about me. I'm an auntie to 6. I'm a daughter, a sister, also a strong feminist, a football fan, a swimmer, and a cat mom to 2, who are both boys, but that's fine. Awesome. So kind of navigating into a little bit of what we talked about before of why we need the conversation. So why this is important is sexism in the workplace is no way a hurdle that we have overcome. These are definitely still challenges that women face each and every day. Women exist very heavily in standard form in the classrooms of student affairs settings, but we do not often exist very heavily in positions of power. So senior leadership positions and things of that nature. So kind of just identifying why this conversation needs to happen and just pointing out some of those things. It also is something that despite the fact that student affairs classrooms are still really female dominated, the turnover is not the same. So if you continue to look at just like your hierarchy, your organizational structure, you might start to notice some of those themes that Michelle and I talked about of just still having all male identified supervisors, some of which I love and are great, but just noticing that we've been in the field for a minute and it's the first time that's happened for us is kind of the idea of why this conversation is important for us. And then just to illustrate our point, which is a little bit of humor, we are both people who enjoy comedy and sarcasm. So we hope that this helps just kind of show that as well.
How do you walk in those shoes?
Maybe we could restructure.
Here's an idea. How about we restructure?
Yes, great idea, Joanna. So how do you manage the work-life balance? You like to bake? How about you handle the cake for Gina's birthday? Is work less of a priority for you now? Does your wife help with the kids? Wow. Are you going to eat all that yourself? Well, we shouldn't have too many men on the project. You know how that can be. I'm assuming you two can work together without getting catty.
And then I said, well, I didn't know that.
Look at you being funny. I didn't know men could be funny.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. So I hope that just kind of illustrated just a little bit of humor, but kind of just to preface some of the things we're going to talk about today. But with that also is kind of some of the things that while it's funny in a video, Michelle and I have had the conversation of we've experienced most of those things. And a lot of those things are things that have actually been said to us within our time, whether it was even in roles as a student and all the way up to now. So just illustrating it with some humor, but identifying that those are real experiences that happen. And then just to kind of talk about also like why the conversation is important, but for us on a personal level, why it matters for us. So for us, it's a lot about the other women in our life. So I'll let Michelle talk about those folks for her. But for me, some of those pictures majority are my nieces, my mom, my sister, those kinds of folks. But talking about the fact that I have 6 nieces and nephews, and I want to make sure that the world that they grew up in is a little bit different than the world that I grew up in. And so whether that means for my nieces that they don't have to go through some of the stuff that we did, or for my nephews, understanding how they can make things a little bit different for their future world.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. You can see in some of the pictures that I had shared, most of them are my daughters in various states of the pictures. But for me, it's really important that, similar to Katie, they're growing up in a world where they know and understand how to exist in the space, how to be strong women and girls in the spaces that they're in. But then also in the bottom left-hand corner are some women, both my sisters and friends, girlfriends that I've had for decades, and they have positively impacted me as I've navigated my career, navigated my life. And then in the middle, in our very proud Cardinals gear, is my family, my grandmother on the far right, and then my mother and my two sisters. And all of these women have had a really strong impact on me. And where I really started noticing the work needed to be done was when my now almost 6-year-old was coming home from daycare at the age of 3 and apologizing for things that she wasn't doing wrong. And now actually my 2-year-old is doing the exact same thing at 2. I thought, gosh, wow, how are they learning this? How am I going to help teach them differently? And so for me, that's when the work became really important to me and pretty personal to me as well.
Great. And taking it out just a little bit from the local level of why it's important to us personally and why we talk about this and do this work, thinking about just outside of student affairs in general. This is a national conversation. It's happening on many platforms through many women all over our country and even our world. So yes, we are in a place right now where we have definitely made some progress as female identifying folks, and we should and can celebrate those things. But we are not done yet. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And oftentimes pictures like that bottom left are still way too common. So we need to continue to work to address those things.
All right, so we're going to jump into some content and some examples. And the book that we used to really build most of this presentation was Feminist Fight Club by Jessica Bennett. So we're going to reference pieces of her book. Certainly, she's got a lot more information in the book. Some of the themes include know the enemy, know thyself, and booby traps. And so we've combined some of those themes for the purposes of this presentation. And we're going to highlight a few that stood out the most to us. So here are some of the behaviors that are in the book. The 4 that we're going to discuss today are the mansplainer, the office mom, the over apologizer, and the note taker. And we really like videos, so we've got a couple of videos as well to help us explain the topic or the behavior itself. And so they're mostly comical in nature, similar to the one that we've already shown, but we feel that they really did represent the real world experiences and examples that we see.
Awesome. So the first one we're going to talk about is the mansplainer. So how many of you know what a mansplainer is? I think a lot of cameras are off, but you can just take a little internal reflection in your office, wherever you may find yourself this morning or this afternoon, and just think about that. When is the last example you can think of where that's happened? Or maybe you don't know what that is and have never heard that term. We're going to talk about it, so don't worry if you don't know what that is. But for a lot of folks, we probably do know what that is, what a mansplainer is. And so how many of us have had to identify it, though, for a male colleague who maybe has never heard that term or doesn't understand what that means? So for those who maybe don't know or have never heard of it, essentially what a mansplainer is it's someone who is a male identifying individual who tries to explain something to a female identifying individual in a very oversimplified way, usually comes off a little condescending. And usually it's them trying to, alleviate your burden of not understanding the material. So they have to come in and make sure you fully grasp the concept. And so the idea with that is that they feel the need to come in and help educate you around what's going on. And so that is, in short, what we call a mansplainer. So we have another video, like Michelle said, we do like videos just to kind of bring a little humor to what this is, because I do believe it's one of the most common things we see in the workplace.
All right, that one makes me chuckle every single time. All right, so we're gonna move on to the office mom. So the office mom usually assumes those office chores, right? So celebrating coworkers for maybe birthdays, anniversaries, accomplishments, throwing showers for folks. Sometimes you'll find them cleaning up after others, especially if you have come together for a gathering or a meeting, or have like a break room if you're in more of a centralized area, or maybe even you'll find them making coffee at upcoming meetings. So really, when women are spending the time doing chores, if you will, they're not spending the time impacting their field of work. And so that valuable time is missed. And it really does add up in the long run when they're spent time doing the work of the office rather than the work that they were hired to do specifically. In the book, one of the women quoted her mom shared with her to never learn to make coffee. That way, when she's asked, she can honestly say that she doesn't know how to make coffee. And I thought that was a really interesting piece for a mom to share, and for that to be shared in the book. So next is the over apologizer. And this is for me a really personal sort of behavior that we talk about. So the over apologizer apologizes for taking up space that's earned or deserved. And some of the ways that we have seen examples of that is by bumping into someone on accident, right? Or by being late to a meeting. We're going to discuss this behavior quite a bit more later in the presentation, but we wanted to share a video with you first. There is a moment where there's a little bit of language, so just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of that and can be in tune with that, especially if you're in your office and have the audio on.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I've got to go.
Sorry, I'm not good at this.
I'm sorry. I have a date.
I'm sorry, I'm just a little nervous.
I'm so sorry. Sorry, I had a bite of my bagel and I forgot to pray.
I'm sorry I lost your set of steak knives.
I'm not poor. I am sorry that I allowed myself to love you for all those years. I'm sorry I did nothing but be there for you every minute of every day and support you in your every move. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, sir.
What the Christ?
I'm very sorry, Gaston.
I'm sorry, Miss Crawford.
I'm so sorry, Miranda.
Sorry, that was Amanda.
Sorry, fucking music man.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
If you call to say you're sorry, then call somebody else, because I don't use them anymore.
So that was just, some of the examples of where we see women saying, I'm sorry, when really they're just taking up the space. And like I said, we're going to talk about that here just a little bit more in the presentation.
Great. The next one is the note taker. So similar to Michelle saying the over apologizer hits home for her, the note taker hits home for me. So just another moment of internal reflection wherever you may find yourself right now. Think about how many times in a meeting space or a situation where there's, a conversation between colleagues, are you the one who's taking notes? Or if there's this awkward silence or you're waiting for someone to volunteer, are you the first one to cave and be like, I'll take minutes, it's fine. And think about maybe you're not the one who volunteers to take notes, but how many times is the person who is doing that a female identified person? So this one hits home for me because I was always that person. I was always very quick to be like, oh, we've sat in silence for 11 whole seconds. This is weird. I'll volunteer. And what I never realized or never thought about is by me taking notes in that situation, I'm not contributing to that conversation, right? And so if I'm a part of that meeting, I have a right to be there, or I was invited there, or my professional presence is needed for whatever it may be, and I'm representing my community or whatever, the topic may be at hand. And if I'm just recording everyone else's ideas, my ideas are not part of that meeting agenda or those meeting minutes. So I just want to encourage folks to think about that and think about maybe understanding that in no way is taking notes a bad thing. So one thing Michelle talks about that she kind of shared with me when I first started here was take your own notes. So in no way are we saying you can't take notes. That's how some people learn. You need to have them. That's totally fine. But you don't necessarily need to volunteer to share them with the whole department, because by taking your own notes, you can also just write down what's relevant to you and what's relevant to your specific community and what's going to make sense to you. You don't have to translate it to make sense to all 35 people in your department. So one of those things that just hold on to, might work for you. Another thing is, if you find your department getting into kind of this struggle or tug of war over who's going to take notes, start a schedule. We did that a year ago and it was so much better. So there was just a rotating schedule of, we walked in the space and we didn't waste the first 6 minutes, waiting for someone to volunteer to take notes. We already knew, okay, it's the first Monday of the month. That means Katie's taking notes. And then I knew I didn't have to do it again for 6 weeks or whatever it may be. So taking notes, make sure that that burden is shared amongst the department and doesn't always fall to the same people.
Awesome. All right, so in the book, these behaviors also offer counter fight moves. So some ways to counter those behaviors. So we've taken some of our favorites to share with you, and we would encourage you where applicable and where you're able, we encourage you to actively participate in some of these examples. So the first one is a perfect example of active participation. The high power poses. If you're a fan of Grey's Anatomy, you'll see Amelia Shepherd does this before really important surgeries. You may have also just heard of this where women do the superhero pose, right? Where your hands are on your hips and you stand tall and your chest is high. And so we would encourage you to take a couple moments, if you are in a space where you can stand up, you're able to stand up, to go ahead and try that. And it is something that is really powerful. It helps us take up the space that we earn and deserve. And so the reason that this is a fight move is because women tend to physically take up less space at the table. They'll shrink or they'll consolidate their stuff. There was a time where there were 3 of us in a meeting. The third person came in a little bit later. The 2 of us who had arrived early spread out our stuff, and I spread like I take up 3 seats worth of stuff sometimes. And so my stuff was spread out, and it was in the space where the third person who was coming in later typically sits. And that person also happened to be a man. And when he came in and he wanted to go to his normal seat, I just kind of looked at him and I was like, my stuff's already settled. And so it forced him to go to a different space because I'd already spread out, and we were in a large conference room, so there were plenty of seats there. But making sure that we're taking up the space that we've earned. So these high power poses help give us those confidence that that we should have when we're in situations that are a little bit more challenging or we think might be a little more challenging. So if you haven't had a chance to practice it right now, encourage you to do it at some point, and strongly encourage it when you're going into situations where you feel like you may be undermined or talked over or are just nervous situations for you to enter into.
Awesome. Our next one is your hype person or your hype people. So this is all about having that community. It's all about having that person or a group of people who are there to egg you on. They're just your support system. So in a way that you could use these people in your life aren't just sending quick texts of, you can do this, you got it. Like, those are great and those have their purpose, absolutely. But you can also be super strategic with it. So an example in a work setting that you can use is if I was getting ready to go into a meeting and I was going to pitch a big idea and I was ready to like sell how we're going to do hall closing this year to make sure it's super COVID friendly and all the things. I could be like, hey, Michelle, before we enter this meeting space, I'm going to pitch this idea. It's going to seem a little new and out there for folks. If you could just voice support when I do that, that'd be awesome. And then just go into the meeting confident, knowing that as soon as you say that, Michelle's going to talk up and say, hey, like, that sounds like a great idea, whatever it may be. So in no way is that meant to say that I'm making up Michelle's opinion for her or telling her how she needs to feel about my idea. She's of course allowed to disagree or, voice dissent, but the idea is just to attribute value to what you said and make sure that time is spent on talking about that idea before we move forward. And if it truly wasn't a great idea, then we'll move forward, but at least time was spent hearing that out. And so the idea with that is just to attribute value and to attribute that your voice is being heard in that moment. Another piece of a hype person or people is helping someone when someone's credit was stolen. So if I had walked into that meeting and I voiced that idea about hall closing, and then it just got, we just kept moving and the agenda kept rolling, whatever. 30 minutes later, someone pops in and they're like, hey, you know, I actually think we should do hall closing like this. And it was the same thing that I said 30 minutes ago. A way that you could be a really great hype person. And honestly, for me in our work setting right now, where I find this to be most effective is actually when my male colleagues do this for me. So this is one of the areas that I see a lot of value when they step in and do this, is when they notice that that idea had been kind of not necessarily stolen, but maybe wasn't attributed to who actually stated it in the first place, jump in and say, yeah, that's a great idea. I really love it. Let's throw that back to Katie because she said that first and see, is that what you were intending? And it's not to say that that other person doesn't have value that they can add to the idea. It's just to realign the credit to where it kind of started and make sure that your voice is being heard as the person who brought it to the table. So I also think that those things are things that you can play with depending on your office culture, but those are just a couple examples, and I hope that they are helpful for you.
All right, stop apologizing. And I love this image, right? We have swear jars, but then also the I'm sorry, the saying I'm sorry unnecessarily jar. I love this, right? You can make a lot of money if you fall into this category. So, you know, women tend to apologize for existing. I was just in a meeting full of 10 or 12 amazing women from the region. We were doing a secret sister reveal, and it was funny because I kept hearing people say, I'm sorry, or, you know, I'm sorry, my person's not here, or I'm sorry, my audio is not working, all things that we have zero control over, yet we're apologizing for being in a space or for things out of our control. So some other ways that I have seen the unnecessary apologizing showing up is in the dining center. So you think about when you're at like the soda or pop, whichever way you say it, machine, and the person in front of you is getting theirs, and they turn around and don't realize maybe that you're standing right there. Maybe you're standing a little bit closer than what they anticipated, and they apologize for either being in the way and getting their drink, or they almost maybe bumped into you, and they apologize for that. It's just part of the logistics of being in a dining center, right? And so there's no need to apologize for that. We commonly hear it when women enter a meeting or a room late. And so, you know, sorry for being late, you know, or sorry, I couldn't get my my mic unmuted, right, in the day of virtual meetings now. Also, dissenting ideas in meetings. So if Katie said something in a meeting and I may not necessarily agree with that or don't think that is the approach that we should be taking, sometimes you will hear women say, I'm sorry, but I'd like to offer a different idea. Well, there's no need to apologize for offering different ideas. We all know that groups work effectively when all ideas are heard and all ideas are presented in conversation. So there's no need to apologize for those types of things. And then just nonverbal behaviors that are apologetic in nature. And so women have really been socialized to be polite in all settings, even when they've done nothing wrong. So instead of saying, I'm sorry in these situations, you could say, thank you, right? So if you're entering the room a little bit late because your other meeting ran over or traffic was horrendous that morning, instead of saying, I'm sorry I'm late, you could say, thank you for allowing me to come in late. Thank you for waiting for me if they had waited for you, or just inserting thank you instead of I'm sorry, or just eliminate I'm sorry altogether. Also, making sure that your text communication, so whether it's a text message, an email, a memo that you're writing, eliminates any of the apologetic language. So making sure that the I'm sorry I haven't responded you know, before now. What gets me is when like somebody sends an email in the morning and it's the afternoon, it's like, I'm sorry it's taking me so long to respond to this email. It's like still one work day, right? So one of the ways that you could say that is, thank you for your patience while you were awaiting my response. It's an easy way, and especially if it's been a few days or you've needed to look into something for that.
Awesome. So the next one is squashing negative self-talk. So this is kind of that idea of imposter syndrome. It's that little voice in our heads that is telling us that we are not good enough or qualified enough or pretty enough. So we just stay quiet and we just don't do anything or say anything. But the problem with all of that is that we are enough and you are enough to be in that space and at that table. So when you start to hear that voice and you feel yourself comparing yourself to someone who is better, ask yourself why you view them as better. What makes them better in your head that is allowing you to think negatively about yourself? Are they actually more qualified than you? Because I bet you they aren't. If you're at the same table, you were hired for a reason. You are under the same qualifications. So take a mental list of all the things that actually do qualify you for the position or the table that you're at in that moment, and repeat that to yourself. I know that might sound a little cliche or redundant, but it truly does start to kind of build up that, you know what, I do belong here. And there's that statistic that's when there's a new job description that comes out and there's a posting for a position, male identified folks will apply for the job if they meet only 60% of the qualifications. Whereas women, we will only, I think it was like 90 some percent, will only apply if we meet 100% of the qualifications. Like we will allow ourselves to miss out on an opportunity because there's one thing we don't meet. So think about those things. And when that comes up, squash that voice, remind yourself how qualified you are. And you wouldn't be in this role if you weren't, and you didn't earn your right to be there. And you have just all the same qualifications to be at that table. So take a deep breath, tell yourself how awesome you are, and go exude that confidence. I know that sounds cliche, and I know there are days where that is way harder than others. And so on those days where that is a little bit more difficult, that's where your hype people come in.
All right. If there's anyone out there who, like me, has been, I always talk about being raised in the field, right? Like I've grown up in the field. And so as a graduate student, I was told you should not cry in front of your boss, you should not cry at work, and have come a long way since then. I like to joke a lot at work, and Katie might talk a little bit about this. I don't do my feels at work, and I'm not an F on the Myers-Briggs indicator, but I do cry at work. And so, knowing that it's okay to cry at work, and really it was some women that I look up to in the field who were pretty vocal about sharing when they cried, when they were having a really bad day, because either their personal life was impacting that, or because they were in a space that was upsetting to them in some way, shape, or form. And so I want you to take a pause for a moment and think about, when was the last time that you cried at work? And who are the people that you don't want to cry in front of? Right? I've had some supervisors who've been very vocal about tears don't affect me. And while that is okay, it also definitely sets the stage for how I would present myself in front of that supervisor. And so for me, and probably for many others, it may not have anything to do with being sad at work. It certainly could have something to do with being sad at work, especially, COVID is hard. This is hard work that we're doing these days. And we do hard work even in non-COVID years, very relational, very typically student-centered, and it's hard. So sometimes it is out of sadness, but other times it might be out of passion, very passionate about ideas or the conversation or the meeting. It might be out of pure frustration, and you don't know how to respond any differently. Or it's just how your body kind of naturally responds. I know that certainly tends to be the case for me. Sometimes you might cry because you feel like you've been disregarded or discredited or discounted or forgotten. And so it's okay to cry, and it's okay to know those spaces. And I share a story. Several years ago, we had an Akuhoai intern whose desk space was just outside of my office. And there was a day, it was just a rough day. Things were not going well that day. And I know that she heard me sniffling in my office. And so the next day I asked her to come into my office, and we talked about, what does that mean? I know you overheard me crying and sniffling, and what does that mean? And it's okay to cry at work, and it's okay to show up with your emotions sometimes. So, there are certainly women who cry to get their way, so I don't want to discredit that piece, but more times than not, it is okay to show up in your emotions. I have to remind myself of that as well. And it's okay if you get emotional when doing the work that we're doing.
Awesome. So any marginalized community knows that we cannot do it alone. This is not something that you can do as a solo act. You need people around you who understand the struggle, are willing to vent with you, support you, encourage you. And with that, I think also understanding the different identities that play into this. So yes, Michelle and I are both female identified individuals. We're also both white female identified individuals. So there is an element of intersectionality that we don't fully understand or grasp within this concept that affects other women we work with in different ways. And so understanding and finding those communities that are able to identify with that struggle and are able to show up with you is so important. We need to create that culture of community with this topic as well. It's no different than other identities. And so the book calls it Creating Your Own Feminist Fight Club. And so that's what we would encourage all of us to be able to do moving forward from here. And then within the book, it does outline some rules for the Feminist Fight Club. We can certainly share those things out as well. I know it might be a little bit hard to see on the slide, but within them, kind of the overall overarching theme of it is this quote here actually. And we do believe that this quote kind of just wraps up everything that we love and think about the overall mission of this presentation. And it's each time a woman stands up for herself without knowing it, possibly without even claiming it, she stands up for all women. And so I think that is just kind of if we had to narrow it down to one sentence, the why this conversation is important and why we need this community.
Katie, one of my favorite parts of the rules of the Feminist Fight Club are the first two rules. You must talk about the Feminist Fight Club and you must talk about the Feminist Fight Club. It goes back to Fight Club, right? But for anybody who's seen that movie, but I really enjoy those two rules of the Fight Club. So as awkward as it can be doing virtual or webinar type reflections, we're going to ask for you all to sit and think for a couple moments. We won't make it too terribly awkward, but some questions that we'd like for you to sit and think about or consider is, do you have a hype person? If you do, who are they? And if you don't, who should they be? How do you see these issues that we've talked about showing up on your campus? To Katie's point about the men helping her find some of that balance in her voice when she's maybe been discredited or when other women have been discredited in conversations. Who are the men on your campus that may be part of the problem, but also the part of the solution, right? So I'm going to add that little piece to that question to consider. And then what does your role look like during hiring season as you think about the makeup of your department, the men to women identified staff members ratio? What is your role during the hiring season, and how can maybe you physically get more women a seat at the table? So I'm going to pause for just a few moments so that you can think about some of these questions, maybe jot down a couple notes for yourself. All right, so just a couple of additional kind of questions or things to consider as you keep moving forward on your campus and in the work that you're doing. I'm going to ask you this: how can you position yourself at the table differently now that you know some of these tricks? Whether that means being someone's hype person, being prepared to squash your imposter syndrome thoughts, or forcing yourself not to volunteer to take notes, or even how you physically sit at the table. So we didn't really talk about this one, but part of the book talks about when you're physically sitting at the table, making sure that both feet are on the ground, that your chair is as high as it will go, especially if it's an adjustable one, making sure that you're taking up the space in the meeting. Really, your presence is all about perception and confidence. And so make sure that you're taking up that space that you deserve. So, some takeaways from this conversation. We encourage some of these experiences. So write or experiences, these activities for you to engage in. So write a letter to a gal pal. That could just be a simple little note or even just a text message to say, hey, I was thinking of you. Thank you for everything you do. I appreciate you. Or, giving some specific examples as well. So those notes go a really long way when it comes to recognizing and sharing with others. Make a list of who you want to connect with on your campus. So there might be some women on your campus that you've always kind of looked at from afar, observed from afar. We encourage you to connect with them, reach out, invite them to a virtual coffee or a virtual lunch, and connect with them and just get to know a little bit more about them. Who doesn't love to talk about themselves? So, more times than not, they're going to say yes. And it may not be a good week, but hopefully they'll find a good time to connect with you. We'd also encourage that you make a list of those men that you want to connect with on campus. What are some skill sets or some attributes of men that you want to have more of? Talk with them. Talk about how they show up in meetings or how they present themselves. So sort of this what's next. So Katie and I have participated in a departmental group called Women of Red. We've been a little bit lacking since COVID has hit because, having one more virtual meeting is really challenging, but it's really just a group of women within our department who come together and talk about struggles or challenges that they face as women, both in the work that we do, but then also just in life and in the city that we live in, or on the campus that we're on. We have open conversations within our department, and we're developing, well, not a post-conference community, but we did this at a conference 2 years ago at Michigan State. So but one of the things that we are doing is Glucuho has formed a women's task force. So that group is actively working now to present some ideas to the board of directors and the leadership around formal ways for women to be connected within the association. So, and then we also encourage you to share your experiences, right? We would love to hear your experiences. We've got a bit of time left still. And so we'd love to hear some of your experiences, things that have gone really well, or points of pride where you've been really excited, or, we'll certainly have time for questions if there are any questions that you all have. Katie, anything to add to that one?
No, I think that was great.
All right, so we do have some time for open discussion and questions. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we can take a look on here, but we'd love to open it up for questions.
And feel free just to drop them in the chat. We can save them or talk about it.
So there's one question in the Q&A. What does RED mean in Women of Red? Great question. So RED is Resident Education and Development. It is our department name. So that's what it stands for. Good question.
And if you're wanting to share out as well and not drop it in the chat, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. We can go ahead and make sure that you're able to speak.
All right, well, folks are thinking about the questions they want to ask. type in as quickly as they can. I'll just offer out that sort of through the task force and sort of not through the task force, there are monthly opportunities to connect with women amongst the region. So if you are interested in being included in those email invites, please let Katie or I know. We will get you connected the way that you want to be connected. You don't have to commit to everything every month, but if something piques your interest, then certainly we would love for you to participate in that if you're interested.
There's another question that says, any other behaviors that you find common in higher ed besides the 4 that you focused on from the book? That was quite the list. Yes, you're right. There is a huge list in the book. There's definitely some more too that I think we could identify that weren't necessarily in the book as well. I think one that comes to mind that I deal with a lot, and maybe this is just like on the top of my brain because I literally had this conversation this week. So just for some context, the role that I serve on right now is a mid-level position, and I'm the only female identified person on my team. And so within that, there was a conversation of I was approached. It was just one of those days where I had 12 hours of work and 8 hours to do it. And so I was just like rushing through stuff. And if anyone's familiar with like the disc style, I'm a strong D, like I'm a very efficient, just get stuff done like person, and very type A, all the things. And so I was just like rushing through and sending Teams chats to like coordinate a couple things. And someone tried to, or not tried to, they said, can I offer you some feedback? And I was like, what's going on? And they're like, you know, when you just send a message that quickly like that, you don't even say good morning. Like that was a little rude. It's like, what part of me asking for your availability was rude? So there had to be a context conversation there about, did it seem rude to you because I'm the one who asked for it without a nicety prefacing the message? Or did it seem rude because I truly didn't say good morning to you? And so I think that conversation sparked differently. And I phrased it differently of saying, okay, so if it hadn't been me who asked and it had been, you know, Bob who asked you, would you have replied differently? And thankfully this is someone I have a decent, honest relationship with, that they were like, actually took a moment to reflect and said, you know what, I would not have replied to them and said that to them, that I needed to offer them feedback about the way they phrased that. Said, okay, thank you for being honest with yourself. Let me know if you want to talk about that further. And we just kept it rolling. But I think that would be one of the ones that I think a behavior that comes out often would be the feeling like I have to provide niceties all the time.
I echo that, Katie. I find that a lot as well. So I think that's a great example of common. All right, Shamika asked a question. Thank you for the feedback. Can you talk a bit about what is most challenging about doing these things, taking up space, not saying I'm sorry, etc., even when you know we should? Whew, that's a good question, right? I think for me, it's about having that self realization, right? And recognizing when I'm doing the things that I'm doing, and that moment of uncomfortableness or discomfort, I guess is the word I should probably use, but that moment of discomfort where it's like, I should apologize. No, don't apologize, right? I have those conversations a lot in my head, or like, if I catch myself moving my things, then I just pause and I move them right back, right? And so some of that is just that internal, recognition of when that's happening, but also it's important to have those folks around you to say either in the moment, Michelle, you don't need to apologize for that. Thank you, or after the conversation for Katie to pull me aside and say, hey, did you realize that you apologized for giving some really honest feedback in that conversation? And it might be, yeah, I needed to because politically I had to, right? That's a whole different presentation and conversation. Or it could be, I didn't even realize that. Thanks for pointing it out to me. And next time we'll make sure, next time I'll make sure I'm a little more conscious. So I think those are for me, the most challenging pieces is when I'm not realizing it or when I'm catching myself in the moment. How do I respond? Do I continue the behavior, or do I stop in my tracks and not do the behavior in that moment? So I don't know if Katie has more to offer.
No, I think that was great. And there's another question from just an anonymous. It says, do you have tips on providing feedback, especially to male supervisors or coworkers, on sexist behavior, such as being talked over, especially when our feelings about it becomes the focus as opposed to the actual impact or the facts of what they are doing? Yeah, so I think that is one of the things that, going to the last question as well, is one of the things that's most challenging, is that oftentimes when you do provide that feedback or have that conversation and you gear yourself up to go do it, then it becomes that you're just oversensitive or you got offended or whatever it may be. I think one of my biggest tips in that situation is what Michelle said of check with your people first. And I would say have your people at your department because they know your office culture and they know what's going on. And maybe they were actually in that space with you and can say, maybe you were a little out of line, or they can say, no, you have no reason to apologize for that. Also have people outside your department. There are going to be things that just aren't okay to talk about with some of the people you work with. And that's just how it goes. So I think having those people that you can vent to outside of your department are also really critical. So I would, when I have to have these conversations, I run those by those people first, and make sure like what I'm thinking is kind of just checking in that they would do the same or similar reaction, or they might have an idea that I haven't thought about. And then my biggest tip is framing it to when I'm offering that feedback. I try really hard not to say the word I feel. And I know that sounds counterproductive to how we lead like roommate conflicts and all those kinds of things with our students, but I try really hard to not use the word feel and say, make it action based. So not you made me feel like this, but saying by saying this, you negated my opinion. Instead of saying like I feel like you took credit from me, say you took my, situation or the idea, whatever it may be. So make it action-based, less feeling-based with the literal language you use when offering that feedback. I also will say if you have a trusted male colleague, so I do have a couple folks in my department who are male identified. I've brought them into meetings with me. I have dragged them into a space with me and been like, help him understand that the way he spoke to me versus the way he spoke to you was different, and that's not okay. And if you have that relationship with them, I understand that that's a privilege that I have that. If you have that relationship, use them, because they hear it differently from someone they identify with. And that's true of any, I think, identity. Like if Michelle offered me feedback, I'd hear that differently than if someone else offered me feedback. So I think using that to your advantage is also something that can be important. And finally, I would say using the tool I just talked about in a different story, but phrasing it to them of, if so-and-so had said this to you, would you have reacted the same way? And it truly allows them to go, oh, I maybe really wouldn't have. Okay, cool. Now we can move on and talk about that.
Marianne has a great question. I love this. I'm wondering the last time we had we as an association had a male identified secretary on the leadership team. Who can we nominate this year since the secretary position is open? I think that's an excellent idea, Marianne. I have thought about that as well, and I don't have a good answer to your question, but we'll encourage everyone who's on the call to also consider who a male identified secretary for Glakuho could be, as we have nominations open right now. Jeremy for secretary, that's what I heard. I see that too. All right. Any last, same for technology, female technology coordinator. I agree. And also exhibitor liaison has been male for at least a decade. So it has been a second. And I think that it is time for some of our women to get nominated for this. So I think we're at time. Katie and I are more than happy to answer any other questions that you have. You can find our email addresses on the website. I think that they may also be part of this presentation, but I could have mistaken that as well because I just can't remember that long ago already. But you can find them on uc.edu/housing. Find our email addresses there. We'd be happy to answer more questions or just get to know you as well. So thank you all for attending. We appreciate you spending, if it was your lunch with us. And if it wasn't your lunch, you were leading up to lunch with us this afternoon.